Picture this. It's dawn in the year 1500. The streets of Madrid stir awake under foreign banners. Atop its grand cathedral, instead of a cross, a golden emblem of the Mali Empire glitters in the sunrise. African horsemen patrol the city gates. The Spanish court now speaks not in Castilian, but in Mandinka. Across the continent, London, Paris, and Rome bow to the power of kings and emperors from Africa. This isn't just fantasy. This is the alternate history of a world where Africa, not Europe, rose to dominate global exploration, trade, and empire. But how could this have happened? And more importantly, if Africa had colonized Europe, how would our modern world, our languages, religions, even the borders we take for granted, look completely different today? Stay with me until the end, because this journey through alternate history will completely flip your understanding of how fragile the balance of power really is. Every alternate history needs a point of departure, the moment where timelines split. For this scenario, we go back to medieval Africa. In our timeline, Europe gained an edge through maritime exploration in the 15th century. But African civilizations were hardly behind. The Mali Empire, Songhai, Great Zimbabwe, Ethiopia, and the Swahili coast thrived. Timbuktu was one of the world's greatest centers of learning, rivaling anything in Europe. African traders already navigated vast deserts, mastered trade across the Indian Ocean, and commanded immense wealth in gold and salt. So what if African rulers had poured their wealth into naval technology? Imagine if, by the 13th or 14th century, African empires launched large-scale fleets, modeled after Arab dhows and Chinese junks, but improved with innovations in hull design, navigation, and sails. With these ships, African explorers could sail north into the Mediterranean, bypassing Arab middlemen, and establish colonies along Iberia and southern France. Instead of the Portuguese rounding Africa, African sailors would be docking in Lisbon. Cause and effect is key. Earlier African naval dominance, disruption of European kingdoms, Africa seizing control of exploration. And if African ships were first to cross the Atlantic, the entire age of discovery belongs to Africa. But how would Europe react to being colonized? The short-term consequences of African colonization. Let's step into this alternate 15th century. African fleets land on Iberian shores. Lisbon falls under the banners of Mali. Seville becomes a trading hub, not for Spanish merchants, but African governors. Unlike Africa in real history, Europe is filled with fractured kingdoms constantly at war. African colonizers exploit this disunity, siding with some rulers against others, installing client kings and demanding tribute. The Iberian Peninsula, always vulnerable, becomes Africa's first colony in Europe. Religious clashes follow. Christianity collides with African Islam, indigenous animist traditions, and perhaps new hybrid faiths. Cathedrals are repurposed as centers of African administration. European peasants, once bound to feudal lords, now owe allegiance to foreign emperors. But Africans wouldn't just conquer through force. They would reshape trade. Gold from West Africa floods into Europe. Salt, ivory, and spices move north, while European timber, iron, and wool flow south. A new Afro-European economy emerges, one where Africa holds the upper hand. Within decades, Europe looks less like a collection of kingdoms and more like a patchwork of African vassal states. And yet, this is only the opening act. Because if Africa dominates Europe, what does that mean for the Americas and the rest of the world? With Europe under African dominance, the balance of power across the globe flips. Control of Iberia and the Mediterranean gives Africa mastery over Atlantic trade routes. By the late 15th century, African fleets push westward, discovering the Americas. This changes everything. In our world, the Spanish and Portuguese carved up the New World. Here, it's African conquistadors, or perhaps African explorers who integrate with indigenous peoples differently. Instead of Catholic missions, you see mosques, African shrines, and hybrid spiritual traditions across Mexico, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The Columbian exchange also reverses. Crops like maize and potatoes are carried not to Europe, but to Africa, fueling population booms in West and East Africa centuries earlier than in our timeline. And before we explore how this reshapes the Americas and Asia, let me quickly say this. If you're enjoying this dive into alternate history, imagine what other what-ifs are waiting, from lost empires to revolutions that never happened. Make sure to like this video, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss the next journey through history's biggest twists. Because this African empire is only getting started. How would this shift affect the Americas, Asia, and beyond? By the 16th century, the ripple effects are massive. The Americas, African colonies dominate Brazil, the Caribbean, and Mesoamerica. Instead of millions of Africans enslaved and shipped across the Atlantic, it's possible that European peasants become the exploited labor class. Europeans, not Africans, might face forced migration and servitude in mines and plantations. Imagine Irish laborers cutting sugar in the Caribbean under African overseers. Asia. The Indian Ocean was already an African trading world, with Swahili merchants trading with India, Arabia, and China. In this timeline, Africa doubles down, establishing fortified ports in India, Indonesia, and even southern China. European merchants? Marginalized, perhaps begging for access. Technology. With African access to American silver, gold, and crops, Africa industrializes centuries earlier. Steam engines, gunpowder weapons, and printing presses develop under African patronage, not European. Africa becomes the center of global power, with Europe a colonized periphery. But what would daily life in this world look like? What languages would you speak? What religions would dominate? Fast forward to the 20th and 21st centuries. This world is nearly unrecognizable. Languages. Instead of English, Spanish, or French dominating global communication, you might be fluent in Swahili, Mandinka, Hausa, or Amharic. African languages become the lingua franca of trade, diplomacy, and science. Religion. Christianity would survive, but as a marginalized or regional faith. African Islam, Yoruba traditions, or even newly blended Afro-European faiths dominate. The Vatican, possibly relocated to Timbuktu under African oversight. Culture. European Renaissance art might bloom not in Florence but in Timbuktu. Imagine Leonardo da Vinci working for an African patron, designing machines for Mansa Musa's descendants. Beethoven writing symphonies for an African emperor. Shakespeare staging plays in praise of African rulers. Politics. Instead of European nations carving up Africa at the Berlin Conference, Africa might carve up Europe. Germany, France, and England become colonies ruled from African capitals. European nationalism might echo African resistance movements of our timeline. Technology. The Industrial Revolution launches in Africa. Trains, telegraphs, and electricity spread first across the Sahara and the Nile, then into colonized Europe. By the 21st century, African megacities rival New York, London, or Beijing in our reality. Our modern world is an African-centered global civilization, with Europe a colonized region. But this raises one final question. What lessons can this alternate history teach us about our world today? This scenario, Africa colonizing Europe, is not about revenge fantasy. It's about perspective. History is not destiny. The rise of Europe was not inevitable. It was a product of timing, geography, technology, and chance. A few small changes, an African naval revolution, political unity, or different trade routes, could have reversed everything. If Africa had colonized Europe, oppression might have worn a different face, but the same dynamics of power and exploitation would still exist. Yet exploring this what if forces us to confront how fragile dominance is, how easily history could have been rewritten. So when we ask, what if Africa colonized Europe? The real answer is not just a new map. It's a challenge to imagine a world where power isn't taken for granted and to recognize that today's inequalities are not eternal truths, but human-made systems. If you found this alternate history thought-provoking, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell. We'll explore even more fascinating what-ifs, from lost empires to revolutions that changed everything. Because history isn't just what happened, it's what could have happened. And maybe, just maybe, the world we live in is only one version of 1,000 possible stories.